Well, as everyone starts entering our Zoom room, I want to say welcome again to today's Welcome Change Conversations. We hope to hear from social entrepreneurs in these conversations about what is working, what's next, and what's making them hopeful. And so with that, good afternoon, and we're delighted to have with us Ariel Koren today. There are more than 7,000 languages in the world. And with global communication systems being so dominated by English, the result is often a devaluation of other languages that end up getting minoritized. Research points out that this failure to consider multilingual systems in finance and health, in housing, in education, and all the systems around us creates challenges in building trust and resilience in communities. In the US itself, data shows that 1 in 10 working adults have limited English language proficiency. What this means is that it results in lower quality healthcare, less care seeking, and generally overall poor health outcomes. It leads to financial isolation. FDIC data shows that households where Spanish is the only language spoken lack bank accounts. That's 5 times lower at 35%. Than all households across the US. It's an issue in asylum seeking where all application materials have to be submitted in English and little or no translation support exists. Judges are regularly disqualifying asylum claims based on technicalities and language. These are the issues we're going to talk about today. I'm Manmeet Mehta with the Ashoka team, and we are privileged to be joined by one of our newly elected Ashoka Fellows, Ariel Koren. Welcome, Ariel.
Thank you. Thanks, Manmeet, for having me. Thanks to everyone who's joined. Also, huge thank you to Romina and Tatiana, our interpreters, who are also super badass leaders on the Respond team. So just wanted to shout out the interpreters as well.
Yes. You'll notice in the chat, there is a detail on Spanish language interpretation that's available for this conversation. Ariel is the founder of Respond Crisis Translation. It's a grassroots organization, and we're going to spend the next half hour learning from Ariel about language access as a basic right. What happens if English is not your first language in the US? What does all of this have to do with equity and economic justice? Ariel started Respond Crisis Translation only 3 years ago, and it is now a collective of 3,000 translators and interpreters representing 108 languages. So we're going to dive in, but some quick housekeeping notes before we start. Again, translations and interpretation details are available in chat. You can switch to the Spanish channel, and please ask Q&A questions through the Q&A functionality, and we will keep track of all of the thoughts and questions coming in. We're going to talk about 20-25 minutes and then try and get to all of your questions before we wrap. And now with only 30 minutes in this conversation, let's dive in. Thanks again, Ariel, for making time. And without much further ado, let's get to the central idea of your work, which is language access. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, language access, it means, creating mobility and empowerment and agency for folks who don't speak the dominant language, right? Language access, it's when we use the word language access and Respond Crisis Translation, we're referring to our direct service work. So we're a collective of, like you said, close to 3,000 translators and interpreters who mobilize around the clock to provide compassionate and trauma-informed translation and interpreting and language and just language, generally language support to anyone who's experiencing a crisis or a situation where language is a barrier to getting support. But the folks in our collective really push and insist on taking the concept of language access to the next level and talking, instead of language access, about language justice. And language justice is a world where language access isn't even necessary because the dominant language system has been dismantled, right? Language is a tool of the carceral state, of imperialism, of white supremacy, Anglo supremacy. And so it's this concept that there is no dominant language that is oppressing and forcing people to exile such an important part of their identity and creating a complete lack of freedom of mobility for people. So we really tried to push the concept of language access further and discuss language justice and what it means to dismantle systems of language violence, which I know we'll talk about a little bit as well.
Yeah, you've said, and I found it really interesting, the rules of language are written by elite members of society, even while language itself is written by everyone else. Tell us a little bit more and how this relates to what you just mentioned, the idea of language justice and violence.
Yeah, so Respond crisis translation formed originally because, those of us who are interpreters and translators and language practitioners had spent, prior to founding Respond, years bearing witness to the language-based violence that underpins, like you mentioned, Manmeet, at the beginning, literally every single system across this country. But to start with asylum, just literally as the tip of the iceberg, the asylum system, the average person doesn't even realize that an asylum application is this big, right? It's hundreds and hundreds of pages for just one single asylum application. Talking about the US specifically, folks who are seeking asylum are forced to compile hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence detailing literally the most vulnerable and traumatic and violent moments that they've experienced in their life, that they have to then hand over to the government in order to convince the government that they're worthy of just dignity and safety. Most of the people who are compiling asylum applications while doing that are experiencing the acute trauma of the violent carceral detention system. So literally the acute trauma of being detained in a place where no one is speaking your language or interpreting or translating for you. And folks are expected to compile asylum applications, those hundreds of pages, and then translate them all into English because the government only accepts asylum materials in English. And yet there is no centralized program or system or subsidies for folks to actually access translators and interpreters. So literally people are on their own finding some way to translate hundreds and hundreds of pages when the government does not provide that service, right? That service is not provided. And even worse, what we see constantly, literally every single day, is that the government actively weaponizes language to justify rejecting asylum claims. So we frequently see people who literally, because of a language technicality, a misspelled word, a punctuation mark out of place, things that seem so minor, an entire asylum application will be rejected, meaning that someone is issued a deportation, denied access to asylum just because of language. And so there's this reframing that all of the translators and interpreters in our collective are insisting on, which is this is not language barriers, right? This is language violence. The difference is that there's not just this arbitrary, coincidental lack of language access for folks. It's that the government is actively using language as a weapon, right? As a tool to make freedom of mobility completely possible to anyone who doesn't speak English.
Yeah, and so not only it seems that your work is often required in the context of people finding themselves in extremely challenging and vulnerable situations that causes trauma. You've talked a little bit also about how the lack of language access itself creates trauma. Can you talk a little bit about that when you say it's a trauma-informed approach to your work?
Yeah, so we're a collective of close to 3,000 translators and interpreters across 110 languages. So we're really just inherently grassroots. But at the same time, I think one of the things that really unites all of the translators across all languages is that we all center a trauma-informed approach. Which is something that we really emphasize, and all of our translators and interpreters go through trauma-informed training and learn about, kind of creating a shared definition of what does it mean to be a trauma-informed interpreter or translator. So going back to asylum, just as an example, interpreters in the US court systems are told that they need to be neutral, right? This is something that's really common. Interpreters are told to be neutral, but the average interpreter actually interprets the concept of neutrality as I need to be adversarial. And the reason for this is that the average interpreter views themselves as having the judge in an immigration proceeding, right, as being their client. And because we have such a carceral immigration system, the asylum seeker is viewed as the enemy, right? The asylum seeker needs to prove themselves to the judge. So the interpreter views themselves as being loyal towards the judge and therefore adversarial towards the asylum seeker, which we have seen countless cases where folks report that they were so nervous due to the hostility, literally the hostility of the interpreter in asylum court, that they were completely incapable of even communicating their asylum case. And just to take that, a step further, the United States court system, there is no centralized language access plan in terms of vetting translators and interpreters. So translators and interpreters in this country are not required to be vetted. We found that what we estimate in over 90% of immigration proceedings, there are mistranslations and misinterpretations that actually lead to core elements of the asylum seeker story being mistranslated and misinterpreted. And we believe that in a very, very large percentage of cases where folks are issued a deportation, language has played a really crucial role in why the story wasn't conveyed properly to the judge. So it's lack of competency, lack of qualifications, the fact that folks are not vetted based on dialect and accent, but then even worse, the fact that, interpreters are very frequently not trauma informed, and even worse, explicitly hostile. So in Respond, we really try to be an antidote to that. We try to ensure that we have an entire collective full of folks who are trauma informed, who are compassionate, who are able to really center the voice of the person for whom you're interpreting, and ensure that you're creating a safe space where someone can really share their story, not just linguistically, but also emotionally.
That's really powerful, and sort of inherent in what you just shared with us is this thread of agency and power. And so decentralized as you are, and your interpreters are spread out across the world, you are also shifting power in these situations and how individuals interact with these systems that are supposed and are meant to work for their benefit. And that's incredibly powerful. You've grown, Ariel, really rapidly. You've mentioned, there's about 3,000 interpreters and translators. You're working in nearly 110 languages. How are you finding these interpreters? How are you growing? And tell us a little bit more about the work that you're currently doing. What's on your mind right now?
Yeah, so, everyone in this call is obviously painfully aware that political and environmental crises are forcing millions and millions of people to flee their homes each day. So there are just countless examples, but I'll give just a few. Like one that I know is really top of mind right now for everyone is the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. Our team is mobilizing already around the clock to respond to that. I want to uplift the voices right now of our Kurdish interpreters. Our Kurdish interpreters have reported to us that the Turkish government, in response to the earthquake, has intentionally been suppressing access to information in Kurdish, in spite of the fact that the majority of victims of this earthquake are not actually Turkish speakers. So our team's been mobilizing to translate resources and to interpret in Kurdish, Kurmanji, and Sorani, in Arabic, Armenian, in addition to Turkish, to talk about some other stuff that's happening. And that's really top of mind for us. Before the war, the genocidal war on Ukraine broke out, we had around like 5 or 6 Ukrainian and Russian interpreters, and our team lead, our Ukrainian and Russian team lead, Tanya Grigorieva, has grown that team, stepped in and literally within weeks grew the team. The team is now 600 Ukrainian and Russian interpreters who are, again, mobilizing around the clock, supporting thousands of Ukrainian folks who are resettling all across mostly Europe. So translating and interpreting in medical, in legal, in asylum contexts for Ukrainian folks, from Ukrainian and Russian into Polish, German, Czech, English, French, Spanish, a whole array of different languages, and just supporting folks in finding mobility and being able to resettle. Another, really, really important example is the work being led by Uma Murkhail, who's the leader of our Afghan languages team. I'm specifically leading our team of Dari and Pashto interpreters and translators. So this is a team of close to 40 interpreters who are all Afghan folks who speak Dari and Pashto, who are also mobilizing around the clock to support Afghans. Mostly are based actually in Afghanistan and earning their full income through the work that they're doing, the translation and interpretation work with Respond. I think it's really important to highlight the fact that the world has at this point turned its back on Afghanistan, and most of the translators and interpreters in our network reported that all of the other translation companies that they worked with just dropped them because they no longer knew how to even get money into Afghanistan. So folks who are still based in Afghanistan, specifically interpreters and translators and language practitioners, are experiencing persecution because of their job and their profession, but also because of the fact that all of the international agencies that employed them are no longer paying them. So Uma is leading this incredible team that has so far translated 142 humanitarian parole applications for Afghan folks who are seeking asylum and applying for humanitarian parole all around the world. Another example is that the Biden administration has deported over 20,000 Haitians to Haiti. Our Haitian Creole team, we estimate spends around 300 hours doing emergency oral interpreting every single month in support of Haitian folks at the border and within our borders. And another example, so Tatiana and Romina are actually interpreting this call right now. Tatiana is our current Spanish team lead. This team in the past year has translated 20,000 pages for over 5,500 asylum cases just in the past year. So these are kind of some of the top of mind examples. And this is in addition to all of the day-to-day casework that's being led by our collective.
One last question about the network, and then I want to sort of zoom out a bit. How do people find you, and who do you partner with as you consider these new very complex situations where language access becomes very, very critical and urgent?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really grassroots effort. So I think we've kind of found each other. Like a lot of folks who are translators and interpreters have found Respond while either searching for paid work because of how hard it is. And we think, well, I know we'll get into that later, but because of how hard it is to find paid work as a translator and interpreter. And then folks who are interested in donating their time and their talent as language practitioners who want to do pro bono work also kind of seek out Respond and find us really just naturally through word of mouth, online. The language community is a pretty tight community, I think. So we tend to find each other. And we partner with over 260 organizations that really range in size from being organizations that are like as large as, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center or UNICEF or HIAS, right? We work with really, really large partners. And then we work with grassroots collectives, right? Like the Texas Nicaragua community, collectives that don't even have names, but are just groups of abolitionists, legal assistants and activists and folks who are organizing, will reach out to us and request our language access support. So there's like a huge range in terms of the folks that we support, but that's also mostly through word of mouth. So people who need the support will talk to other folks who have been in touch with us, and word of mouth will kind of help people to find us.
That's incredible. Pausing a little bit here and just sort of absorbing all of that, we sort of take a step back from all of these different, very urgent pieces of work and sort of zoom out, and that you have a larger vision for this work around language justice and access. And you frame it as an economic justice issue, and this is a reframing. So tell us a little bit more about this vision and what that world looks like, where it starts to come to life.
Yeah, well, the government would like us to believe that the dire translator and interpreter shortage at our borders and within our borders, that's literally costing people their lives and their access to freedom of mobility, they would like us to believe that this is a talent issue. So we see countless cases where folks are literally forced to languish in detention centers or in really dangerous situations at the border because of the fact that they're waiting for so long for a linguistic match interpreter to be provided to them. So literally because there is not an interpreter available to take their case and to allow them to go through an interview, to apply to asylum. They are just told that they need to languish and wait. And the government would like for us to believe that this shortage is a talent issue, that the interpreters and translators don't exist. And that's not true. It's not a talent issue. It's an economic justice issue. It's a funding issue. The talent is there. The language diversity, the folks who are speakers, native speakers of all of the languages that this country systemically marginalizes are there. They're just literally not being paid. It's not even that they're underpaid, it's that they're completely unpaid. And language practitioners are forced to essentially make up like a very disproportionately unpaid labor force, right? And so what we really insist is that language work is essential work, and it therefore needs to be funded systemically, right? We need talent to career pipelines. Folks who speak all of the languages that this country marginalizes need to have access to actually becoming translators and interpreters. Translation and interpretation should be a viable career option for people. And so right now, we have close to 3,000 translators and interpreters in our network. 400 are actually earning an income through this work. The rest of folks are volunteers. And so, you know, it sounds like a lot because building out, you know, creating 400 jobs is really paddling upstream. Like it's really difficult, but I think this is really just the beginning. Like we really hope that both within Respond and also way beyond Respond, we can help to have people really see that this needs to be paid work. You need to fund language access. You know, it's not even a funding category. So obviously funding is really stressful and top of mind for every nonprofit organization. But for us, it's even harder because of the fact that language is so invisibilized. And in spite of the fact that you can't possibly respond ethically to situations of crisis without centering the translator interpreter, right? The translator and interpreter is at the center. But in spite of that, language practitioners are completely marginalized and invisibilized and unpaid.
Wow, we can keep talking for an hour. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and we're running out of time. But before we take some questions, I want to pivot to you a little bit, Arielle. I know you don't love talking about yourself, but just to sort of, there's a fascinating thread around language and storytelling across many things you've done. Right? You're a social entrepreneur, you're an activist, you've worked in the tech industry, you speak about 8 languages at least, I think. Tell us a little bit about your journey here.
Well, you know, growing up, my own family was really impacted by language violence on a lot of different levels, and also by language loss. And so I always really knew that I wanted to be working in kind of language-based organizing and language access. You know, at the beginning of my career was working at Google Translate, which, you know, seemed to me in theory like it would be a really wonderful place to be for someone who cares a lot about language access and language justice. But unfortunately, myself and some others who were, while working at Google Translate, also actively practicing as language practitioners and interpreters in situations of crisis, we're witnessing the ways that systemically machine translation and technology actually cause immense amounts of harm. Specifically, when I was working at Google Translate and then on the side, also doing a lot of work as an interpreter, I was witnessing the fact that thousands and thousands of people are forced to rely on Google Translate as literally their only communication tool when they're navigating high stakes situations like being in a hospital, you know, experiencing a legal emergency, countless other incidents, countless other types of use cases, as Google Translate would call it, where there were mistranslations, where the quality was off. It's beyond just that a machine is not trauma informed. It's the fact that key information was being mistranslated and there were life or death stakes for folks. And so, you know, myself and other folks who really wanted to escalate our concerns about that, instead of really being embraced by the company, in many cases found that there was systemic retaliation and the suppressing of those voices. So myself and some others who are part of Respond Crisis Translation, who formerly were at Google, decided that this is about building community. It's about organizing. It's about building a collective and getting translators and interpreters to be funded and to be acknowledged, right? And technology, it plays a role, but it isn't the solution. And so that's kind of, you know, the way that I pivoted out of working in tech and into more of like an organizing framework.
This actually, your comments, I think, address some of Sarah's questions in the chat. Which is you're talking about what needs to change immediately around the funding for translators and sort of the way we approach translation. Is there anything else that immediately said this is one of the most important things that needs to change immediately in addition to that?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing, I'll always go back to it, fund language access, right? Like if you want to, language work is essential work. Language workers are essential workers. Fund them, pay them, help us get funding, fund us. That's really what I go back to. Like I had a linguist who's an academic ask me, you know, I really want to help. What language should I learn? But I guess they were implying like, I'm going to learn a language so I can like save people by becoming an interpreter, you know, and it was like, don't learn any language, just fund the people who speak this language, who are systemically unpaid and underpaid. They're there, they're here, they're in our collective, they're doing the work, they just need to be paid for it. And this needs to be beyond just, you know, it's not really like a local issue, it's a systemic issue. This needs to be a funding category. And like, you know, I mentioned some of these global crises that everyone is obviously aware of. But, you know, the international humanitarian aid apparatus, every time there is a crisis, like the devastating earthquake of a couple of weeks ago, is bringing in millions and millions of dollars of funding based on these crises. And yet, even in this world of humanitarian aid organizations and legal aid organizations, there's still no budget that is being allocated towards language access. And once again, if the interpreter and translator is at the center of this response, they need to be centered also from a funding perspective as well. And so I think that's just, you know, the thing that I'll go back to.
And related to that, Ariel, Michael comments, you know, exactly that interpreters have such a front seat view of what's happening in all of these moments and all of these moments of crises around the globe. And can you elaborate or share a perspective on how you can leverage, and you are already pointing to that, how you can leverage this growing network beyond just interpretation and language assistance to the deeper questions you've raised around language justice, but as it also relates to social justice, addressing institutional failures, and more.
Yeah, and this also reminds me of another question I just saw in the chat where someone was asking, like, is the work mostly direct response work, or is there also, you know, like kind of systemic, like policy focused change work that Respond is doing? And we do have a project that's called the Respond Language Democracy Project. And that we started because of the fact that translators and interpreters in our network are constantly, literally every single day at the front lines, bearing witness to the fact that this is a systemic problem, right? And so we need to also respond systemically. And so the Language Democracy Project is really about like, it's a grassroots kind of policy focused effort where we're trying to drive forward policy that centers language justice. There are a lot of different kind of activities that are happening across that initiative, which is still really new. But one example of one of the things that we're working on is that translators in our network have worked together to create a training for attorneys and legal assistants about how to actually identify language rights violations in real time, because of the fact, going back to the fact that like in the court system, translators and interpreters, they're not vetted, they're disproportionately underqualified and often hostile. So we're actually training attorneys on how to in real time identify those language rights violations. And we're sending we're piloting this still, but basically sending observers, language rights observers who are professional translators, interpreters, to actually be present in court proceedings and to be able to bear witness to and record in real time any sort of mistranslation, misinterpretation, language rights violation that later can be documented and used to help someone who's been a victim of that language rights violation to seek justice in the aftermath and to file for appeal. And right now there's no system in place. There's no centralized system in place to actually track and record and even name language rights violations in court systems across the United States, in spite of the fact that they're rampant. So this is really the program that we're trying to pilot right now, creating an actual system for how do we document language rights violations and seek justice in the aftermath.
Got it. I think that is really, that's fascinating. It was one of the questions that I think also relates to Suzanne's comment. And we'll share her contact information. She's generous enough to share, but sort of how can a local agency formally pre-position language translators within their agencies in the context of disaster response. And I think in addition to the asylum and immigration court system cases, do you have any sort of other ideas or other strategies that you're thinking about in a more humanitarian aid context?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is also an infrastructural problem. So responding when a crisis has occurred, as opposed to having a pre-existing infrastructure, I think is kind of an inherently flawed approach, right? Like we should have that infrastructure that already exists. And that's really why Respond does exist, right? We're there to partner with you to actually create that infrastructure for your organization or for your collective or for, you know, the group that you're working with, so that you can be prepared to support people. And, you know, that really leads to the concept of like preventative care. And that, you know, like we talk about preventative care in medicine a lot. Like preventative care means that folks are less likely to experience medical emergencies, but language really applies there as well. Because if you have an interpreter that makes it possible to even go to a doctor's appointment, you're less likely to experience a medical emergency. If you have interpreters in your children's school system, right, you're more likely to just be able to help be engaged with your children, and there's less likely to be disciplinary crises or other forms of school-based emergencies, right? In housing, the same applies. In finance systems, right? You mentioned banking. It's just across the board, like crises are less likely to occur when there is infrastructure and language is not a barrier to folks being able to navigate every single system. And that's why in Respond, like we're not only in acute crisis situations, but we also partner with school systems, with organizations supporting folks navigating school systems, with therapists, with psychologists, with clinics, with, you know, LGBTQ centers, right? We partner with all of these folks who are doing also the preventative work, because we know how important that is in terms of being able to prevent crisis.
I'm excited at, you know, about what you can accomplish here, and which sort of brings me to the question of sort of when you think about impact, right? In the ways that you are thinking about it in more direct and immediate ways, and in these more systemic ways, when you think about 6 months, 6 years, sort of a generation, how are you thinking about the impact that you're making and that you want to make with this movement?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to the like 6 months, 6 years, to that piece, I think one of the really sad realities that we're facing right now is that many people believe that a crisis occurs when it's in the headlines. And that's not how crisis actually works, right? There's the acute crisis, but then there's years and years and years of folks who have been victimized by that crisis, resettling, rebuilding their lives, seeking to navigate systems that are built against them inherently, right? And so like, you know, to go back to these examples of like Ukraine and Afghanistan and Haiti, like folks have completely turned their backs on Afghan people, on Ukrainian people, on Haitian people, because these things are no longer top of mind in the news cycle. But the crisis is happening now. Folks are resettling. You know, we have millions and millions of people that we need to accommodate. And so I think it's like kind of taking an across system approach, asylum being one system, but so many other systems, and ensuring that people don't need to exile their own language identities in order to achieve mobility and to just have safety and dignity.
Yeah, which actually brings me to another question that was raised. We are 3 minutes over, so Ariel, thank you for staying a little bit more. Clearly, this is a conversation that's really resonating, and thanks everyone who's able to stick around with us for a few minutes longer. We'll try and get through as many questions as possible. There's a lot. Speaking about that, what can individuals do? So what are the folks that are listening to this conversation? What can they do if they wish to, they're moved and inspired and want to support this work?
Yeah, well, please be in touch with our team. Like anyone who's in this call, we would absolutely love to be in touch with you. You know, there are so many different ways to support. Obviously, helping to connect us to funding is really, really crucial and important because of how many folks are seeking work and how many folks are seeking our services for free. We hear from thousands of people every month who are requesting emergency interpretation and translation. So, you know, that's one way to support. Being involved in our team, amplifying the voices of language practitioners right now who are, again, like at the front lines of this work is really important. So I think just amplifying these stories and helping us to get the word out about the work we do. And of course, if you know any person, individual, or organization who could partner with us and who would benefit from our support, we would love to support them. So just helping us to get the word out, and of course, like, we'd love to be in touch with you.
Great. Okay, really quickly, you also, there's a request for resources about trauma-informed interpreting, and we can share, Ariel, if you want to just send us a link, we'll share it in the follow-up email. But if there's anything you want to recommend right away.
Yeah, no, we can definitely connect about those resources with folks. I don't think there's, I mean, it's a complex topic, so there's not really like one link that can encapsulate all of it, but we can absolutely connect and share.
Great. And for those that are trying to incorporate sort of language support and language services into different programs, I'm not sure if the speaker works for a nonprofit or the private sector. The general challenge is that language support often comes in as an afterthought. And obviously that is something that you're addressing that needs to be more intrinsic to when we think about designing any sort of system. But what is your advice on where to start with the inclusion of this word?
Yeah, I mean, get in touch with us. Like, we'd love to walk folks through what it means to build out a language access plan, like to create a partnership with folks on the ground who can help to support and respond to your language access needs. And like, one of the really important parts of our framework is the fact that every individual, every person, every group has unique language access needs. And so for us, it's not about like a one size fits all solution, but really like adapting to the needs of every single organization and group. And it looks different, right, across different contexts. So we would love to be in touch and to talk to you about what your need looks like and how we can help to meet that need.
Wonderful. We are very much over time, and I wanna respect that people might have other things to get to. But Ariel, just wrap us up with one last thing. What inspires you to stay on in this work, and are there any other things that you want to talk about a little bit before we wrap?
Our team. If any of our team members are in the call today, it's the team. So just a huge shout out to all of our team members, because again, like language work, it is so frequently invisibilized and marginalized, and language practitioners deserve to be celebrated. So definitely just celebrating every single member of our collective and all of our project managers and folks who are working on the operational piece of just making this, making this work happen all around the clock, right? Mobilizing every day to make sure that this can be a reality.
Wonderful. All right, we will try our best to address any other follow-up. It more directly by sharing Ariel's and RCT's contact information. We'll follow up via email, but we are unfortunately at time. We hope that you enjoyed it, this conversation. In fact, I found it particularly insightful. So thank you again, Ariel, for taking time to chat with us. Thank you, everybody who joined, and for those who have stayed through the conversation. We're really privileged to find and support fellows like you, Ariel, who are doing the important work that sort of reshape and reimagine these systems that are going to work for the benefit of all of us. So with that, thanks again, everyone. Stay tuned for our next conversation. It's on March 8th, International Women's Day, where we're going to look at the crisis of childcare in America and the solutions that are emerging. So thanks again, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.